wait. Hey, it's Romania Black, and it's Psychopaths, episode 3 of the extended edition, or technically episodes 5 and 6. We're just beating right along, aren't we? But it's a pretty long season, so even though I say we're already on episodes 5 and 6 technically, we still got a long way to go. But there's been a lot happened in the series already, and I'm pretty much hooked on this series. I love the concept. I'm loving the characters. I'm loving just the unapologetic gore and grossness of it. I'm like, why not? It's like true crime, the anime, mixed with Blade Runner. So it's a great time, right? But I'm pretty excited. So I am going to, after this episode, wait for some comments, because episode 2 is about to air on Patreon and episode 1 is about to air on YouTube. But I wanted to get a couple episodes in before people really started commenting so I could kind of get a better feel for the show. But man, last episode, we had a lot of things going on. We had Akane getting warned by the two people that don't get along. Both Genoza and Matsuoka, who don't get along with each other, are both telling her, if you keep on trying to be a part of the enforcers, you're going to end up an enforcer and not a handler. And it's like, well, what do we do with that? And then Akane is trying to get to know Kogami, even though everybody's telling her not to. She's like, I can understand him. I don't think she wants to fix him. I don't think it's like that, but she wants to get to know him. And I'm like, girl, if you stray into the darkness, you may not be able to get back out. And it's like, ooh, you know. And then we have, on top of all this, we have Shogo has some mysterious man in a puffer jacket with weird eyes that's helping him. And him and this guy, Mito, have already killed one internet content creator and taken the spot of. And now they've killed a second one. And that second one, who is Spooky Boogie, happens to know Akane, and I'm afraid they're gonna figure that out and use it to find out information about the enforcers in the case. Kind of like a Moriarty. It's giving me a little bit of Death Note vibes, a little bit of Sherlock vibes. It does not bode well. But yeah, I'm really intrigued by this series. I really like it. The discussions I've had a lot of fun with so far, and there's just lots of things to break down with this series, and it's been a lot of fun so far, and I really like the format of the 2 episodes compressed. I really wish the other seasons would do this too, and I was thinking about it today. I was driving home from work, and I was like, I wonder if I could just watch 2 episodes per the other seasons of Psychopaths at a time, because I really like the format of it here. So I may end up doing that. I may end up watching 2 episodes at a time for each season of Psychopaths, even though there's not an extended edition after this first one. I may end up doing that because I just really like it. I think it's fun. I enjoy it. So we'll see how that holds out. But I'm super excited for this episode of Psychopaths and to see what we get. With now that both Spooky Boogie and Talisman are dead, their actual creators are dead, and this Mito guy seems to have taken them over. Is he going to become like a serial killer and start killing other people and stealing their avatars? How does that work? And then it's going to be a case of figuring out who the person taking their lives is and trying to connect the dots. And this kind of mystery stuff is my jam. I love like a Sherlockian, like dark, gritty mystery. There's a book by Dean Koontz called The Face that this is reminding me a lot of. I don't like any of the other Dean Koontz books. He's kind of a creepy author, and his other stuff I've read has been like, ugh. But The Face is amazing. So I guess you get that one book that's good out of all of them. The Face is great. It's a nice holiday mystery, murder, like supernatural story. If you've not read it, I really like it, but highly recommend. But yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes and what we get. So we're not going to waste any more time. Real quick, I want to give a shout out to our philanthropy tier over on Patreon to thank them for all their support, especially during this holiday season. I super appreciate it, and it's very, very helpful. So a special shout out and thanks to Alex Cornejo, to Anime Annie, to Anna, to Be Happy, to Dana, to Destiny Marie, to Edgar, to Eric, to Kiri, to Loisige, as well as Matthew Palfinier, to Nameless Monster, to Saku, to Shimoyama, to Sunspots, to Trails, to Translucent Men, to Tyrone, and to Zakiel. Thank you all so much for your support. I extremely appreciate it. All of my love. Of course. So yeah, we're going to start episode 3 of the extended edition of Psychopaths and just see where this mystery takes us and our special villain Shogo. sipping down Darjeeling and drinking and reading 1984. And we're going to start that here in 3, 2, 1. What a man of taste! Let's see if he shows up at the beginning of this episode. And let's go. Well, I hope y'all are ready for a rhetoric and theory lesson with Professor Romania Black, because that's what we're getting. No! Oh my god! This episode set, episodes 5 and 6, extended episode 3, amazing. I love this episode, and I am in love with this series. And the moment they started talking about Plato's idea, I was like, oh no, like all of my grad school rhetoric theory classes were starting to come back, and I was like, oh, and then they were talking about Lavinia, and I was like, ah, and so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna, before the discussion, I'm gonna write down a couple things on Whiteboard Coon, and be like Kogami with his own Whiteboard Coon, and then suddenly it just like fell down a rabbit hole, and I had to stop because I was using up all of this, and I was like, I need to stop. I will go into a whole 2-hour lecture. Y'all don't want to hear that. So we're going to talk about this episode. We're going to talk about Plato's idea. We're going to talk about Lavinia, because I think the whole concept of Lavinia not only connects to the latter part of this episode, but the entirety of itself and kind of the series. So I feel like Lavinia's, when they mentioned Lavinia, because it's based on Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, I was like, why are we bringing that play up? That's such a random, obscure play. Why that? Why didn't we bring up Hamlet? So, but I feel like, because we could have brought up Hamlet, but this shows like, I am much more cultured and niche than that. So they brought up Lavinia instead, and I think that's an interesting choice, and we're going to talk about it in relation to Akane, in relation to this mean girl gone serial killer, in relations to everything going on, Shion and Kunizuka, their relationship. But yeah, oh my god, so we're going to talk about this, and go through this episode, because it was a lot. There was a lot happening, and I guess I'm going to save Lavinia for the second part of the episode, and you probably can't read this because the marker's not very good, but we're going to go through it. I am going to go ahead and talk about Plato's idea. The Plato's idea is based on, and this is where I'm going to become in teacher mode for a hot second, so bear with me. But basically, Plato's idea is surrounded by this theory of forms. And if you don't know Plato, he is an old Greek rhetorician. He's an old crusty Greek dude that just had thoughts about the world that are pretty insane, and kind of like you can go down a rabbit hole with Plato, with Socrates, with Aristotle, the whole 9 yards. You can fall down a rabbit hole, but we're not going to do that today because we're talking about psychopaths. But I want to give a basic rundown of the Plato's idea and the theory of forms, because it's brought up in this episode, and I feel like as we're going through the episode, we're going to keep coming back to this and talking briefly about it. So what the theory of forms is the idea that the world's not real. The world is real, but it's not as real or true as the forms themselves. The idea of forms is that they are ideas or ideals. And the concept is that ideals, they are absolute, they are non-physical, they are timeless, and they are where we derive knowledge from. And so there's kind of this like little pyramid here. And of course the pyramid is like a perfect shape, right? And so the idea, the pyramid of the theory of forms behind that is that at the very bottom you have individual things. You start out very specific. You're like individuals, like myself, Romania Black, you, my dog Huckleberry. You have like tangible, physical, they're called particulars, and they're individualistic things in the world. You start out very specific, very small, right? Then you start to go up into this idea of phenomena, and phenomena are described as kind of like the shadow of forms. It's like, instead of just Romania Black, it's human. Instead of just Huckleberry, it's a corgi or a dog. You just get broader and broader, right? And so phenomena are kind of like general, broad, but still tangible things that are the shadows of forms themselves. The idea of the forms is that they are this higher form of existence that is non-physical but necessary. And that idea is that there always will be beauty in the world. There will be love in the world. There will be justice in the world. But they're not tangible things. Beauty is subjective, but it's always there, right? Justice can be subjective, but it's always there. Cruelty, hatred, sadness, emotions that we feel, these are all forms, and they exist. We can understand them and we can describe them, but we can't draw them, or if we do draw them, they're different to each individual or each particular, but they are timeless, universal things that cross language barriers, that cross cultural barriers. Everyone experiences sadness, everyone experiences happiness, beauty, hatred. It just comes in different forms. So, but the forms are always there, right? And so that's kind of the concept, is that the goodness at the top is just this overarching ideal and omnipotence, that the forms are always going to be there. Time will change, people will change, but the forms themselves never do. They are always constant and have been for thousands of years, right? And so forms are unqualified perfection. They are always existent, always perfect. It is physical things that are qualified and conditional. That's kind of the whole argument behind it. The forms are always going to be perfect. The particulars are not. And that's kind of humanity. We are not perfect. And so there's this big concept that explains Plato's theory about forms, and it's the idea of a table. What makes a table, right? When we think of it, if you describe a table in any language, whatever a table is, and you're like, well, what is it? Someone can draw it. It's just a rectangle with 4 legs, right? Why do we call that a table? Why is that the table? Why don't we call it something else? Why does every word translate to the same meaning? So it's this idea that we've given this physical thing a shadow of a form. It has a purpose. It has a meaning. So a table is physically here. That is the particular. The form of it is, what does it do? It's a rectangle with 4 legs. But then what is the form of it? What does it symbolize? And you can say that it symbolizes, it symbolizes community. It brings people together. It symbolizes, eating. You can give it a symbolic meaning, but the form is basically, there's a form, then there's a construct that it takes, and then a physical presence. So that's kind of the meaning behind it. Forms are transcendent, and they are the basis of our reality. We have to have forms in order to have a realistic structure. Haha. So, but here's the thing about it, and we're going to bring this up in this episode. We are always outside the reach of a form. We ourselves can never be that form. We are always going to be a particular. We are always going to be a physical entity that is imperfect and not capable of becoming the form, right? It's like the idea that a human cannot draw a perfect circle. It's not possible. You may think you can get close, and you may get very, very, very close, but it is not possible to draw a perfect circle, right? Just like the ratio of pi is an irrational number. It will always go for infinity, endlessly, and never end, right? Which is somewhat beyond our comprehension. We can't rationalize that, but it's true, right? And I always love the idea that forms are discovered. They're not invented. Beauty was not invented. It's always been there. And that will just mind mess you up when you're like, no, wait, it's always been there. No, they're just, wait, what? Like just the idea that no, beauty and hatred in those forms were not discovered. They were discovered, but they were not invented. Humanity didn't create those. They've always been there. And you can say it's from a supernatural presence. It can be from God. You can say whatever, but it's always there. And it's just like, I get so excited about talking about Plato and rhetoric theory. I was like, oh my God, yes. So it's been a while since I've had a grad school rhetoric class, but this episode I was like, oh. So yes, that is the idea behind the theory of forms. That may seem irrelevant right now, but going back to this episode, I think we're going to bring it back up. So I just want to detail that real quick. That was my very quick 8-minute rundown of the theory of forms by Plato. So there you go. So we're going to apply that to this episode in many ways, shapes, and forms, along with the discussion of Lavinia. We'll get into that hoe here in a little bit. I say that. She's not a hoe. We're going to talk about it. But this episode was so good. Oh my God. I loved it. And there's so much to talk about. So I am all for, if we start every episode with Shogo, let's do it. If we start every episode with Shogo, I'm here for it. Sure thing. All right. But what I was wanting to get to is that we start out with Shogo and Cho. His name is Cho. He's the hacker with the weird eyes that is helping Shogo to dispose. And he talks about how he's not really used to disposing of dead bodies. He's not very good at it. And Shogo's like, well, he's like, yeah, you were trespassing and everything. We couldn't waste our time and whatnot. But Shogo is interesting. He's like, what do you think of Mito? We're going to talk about Shogo. He's a fascinating villain. And Cho says he worries me. He's a showed-off that isn't suited for a life of crime, which I agree with. Yeah, Mito bit off more than he can chew. And it becomes very clear by the end of Mito's story that he was really just in it because he idolized these avatars to the point of obsession and the point where he wanted to become them. But here's where it's going to get crazy, right? Because we have the idea of the avatars, and I'm going to write it up here because you guys can't read this bubble, but I can. The avatars are forms. They're forms. They're constants. That's why Mito tries to take on the form of the avatar to make them perfect. But Mito himself cannot become the form of the avatar because he's not them. It's this concept that he can't perform himself. The forms of the avatars are the unqualified perfection, right? But Mito is human. He's not perfect. He's conditioned and he has flaws, so he can never become those, even though he tries to be. And that sort of becomes apparent as this case goes on. So Shogo says what is interesting is that these crimes are to put his true worth to the test, to measure a person's worth. You can't just push them. You have to do more than that. The real way to test them is to give them power. When they gain the freedom to act outside the boundaries of laws and ethics, that's when you see their souls. So Shogo has this concept. Shogo has this idea, and I know that his name is Makishima or whatever. Shogo's easier for me to say, so I'm just going to call him Shogo. Shogo believes that you can't just push people. You have to give them power beyond their limits and freedom, and that's when you see their true souls. Which is kind of interesting because we're going to talk about Kogami in this episode set, and Kogami doesn't really have, I mean, he does have some power, but he's an enforcer, so not really. So it's interesting how Kogami is kind of pushing back against this a little bit. But yeah, Shogo is intriguing. And what is so fascinating to me is what kind of the triangle is right now with Shogo and what's going on. Because you have at the bottom here, you have the particulars. Or you have, in this case, the victims and the killers, right? They're at the bottom of Shogo's little form theory triangle himself, right? So you have the victims and the killers. Then in the middle, you have the idea. So you have, I guess at the bottom are the victims, right? At the bottoms are the victims who are the most flawed in the minds of Shogo and the murderers. Then in the next thing, you have the killers. And then at the step above them in the triangle, you have those aiding them. Those that are the tools of the killers. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then Shogo is the mastermind at the top. Or rather, I don't think maybe necessarily Shogo is at the top of the pyramid. We're going to talk about where his place is in all of this. I feel like the place at the top of this is what Shogo is referring to as human nature. As human nature, or quote unquote their souls. He believes that that's at the top of the pyramid. So it's this weird kind of subversion of Plato's theories of form or idea. He says sometimes you can see their souls. And that's when he says when the weak become strong, when good citizens become free to engage in violence, I'm interested to see what the outcome is. So his whole thing is that he wants to see if I give people the opportunity for violence, what do they do with that? If you've ever watched the movie Seven, he's Kevin Spacey, only much more philosophical. Is basically what he is, and Kogami's Brad Pitt is what it is. And so he says, do you use things like, Cho says, do you use things like high-tech, the net and high-tech avatars? And he says, I use them to check for information and to gather info, but I think people tend to reveal their true selves when they step into an avatar, right? And he says, as I said earlier, they feel some sort of sense of freedom. And that's when he says the freedom easily gained quickly turns into a false sense of omnipotence. Yes. And that's when he brings up, well, he says, I wonder how it will turn out for Mito. And then we cut to the next scene. So it's the idea that the avatars become this form, but this form itself is a way of saying it's omnipotent, right? The forms themselves are omnipotent. They have all this power, and that power can't exactly be taken away once it's out there. Once it's been discovered, it can't escape, right? It can't be destroyed, right? So the idea is also challenged in this episode by the fact that Kogami and them talk about, it's kind of like there's another theory, which I was like, ooh, which is called death of the author. And in this theory, it's the idea that once something is created, now in this case, it's not like the forms, it's a little bit different. It's once something is created and given to the public, you are not in control of it. You don't own it anymore. And the best example of that is if you write in a diary and you keep that diary locked up and you are the only one that reads it, you still have control. Even though you are the author, you still have control of those thoughts because only you possess them. You control them, you own them, you do what you will. The moment you publish that diary as an autobiography, that text is now something consumed by somebody else. And somebody else consuming that text can determine something else about you from it that you may not have even known yourself. And you can't tell them, oh, well, that's not true, because they're like, well, I believe it's true. And that's what death of the author is. It's kind of like, I know a lot of authors are against fan fiction, and they don't like the fact that their characters they've created have been put into these different scenarios. But once you put that character out there and you've given it to the public to consume, it's no longer yours. Technically, legally, you own that character, maybe, but you cannot control how people interpret that character, how they define it, how they rationalize it, how they project upon it. You are no longer in control of that, and that's death of the author. So it's kind of that similar situation with the avatars, in that Mito wants to perform death of the author, being like, well, these are not how I interpret these characters. I interpret them and how they represent myself and how I project upon them this way. And so then they kind of take that idea of death of the author and transcribe it upon the whole form theory, being like, well, if I take it over and become this avatar, then I can control and be this unqualified sense of perfection. And it doesn't work, but it's just, I'm like, yes, please, all of these things. So it's great. I'm nerding out right now. I hope you all are happy because I'm geeking out about this episode. So we cut back to the scene where the very next day, poor Akane, and Akane looks very sad. Akane is sad that things didn't work out at the club. It was a disaster. They didn't get the culprit like they wanted to. And Kogami is so fascinating because Kogami is like Sherlock. He was on it. He was just like, oh, what about this? How about this? What's going on here? And the thing about Kogami is, and I'll put him over here, is that Kogami, he is trying to catch a predator. He is trying to catch the killer. And the only way he knows how is to try and understand and become in the mind of the killer. And so he's like, well, if this guy is depraved as I think he is, I just need to think as depraved as they do. And what would somebody depraved as this killer do? And he's been doing it for 3 years. We're going to talk about the timeline between Sasayama, whatever his name is, the enforcer that died. And it's interesting that it was an enforcer, first of all. That Kogami was close to one of these enforcers. Very similar. Is Kogami our bisexual king of the series? He could be. I'm fine with that. But the similarities between Kogami and Kogani, Ko, and Akane are going to be like off the charts here in a minute when we get to discussing it. But she feels bad that it went down. And then we as the audience know that Spooky Boogie is no longer the girl anymore, Shogo. And instead, Kogami notices that there's some kind of weird, like, fluctuations and something's not quite right. And he's like, I want to go back and check that chat and see what this is, right? I also think the OP is very fitting that it's Kogami fighting himself, and then we have the two of them standing off against one another at the end. But is it going to be that they're going to end up being the same person? I don't know. I'm so excited. But anyway, so they basically run down everything that's been happening at the Talisman Saloon and talk about how seemingly nobody notices that the avatars are acting different than when they were at their lowest. And so what is so fascinating here is that we get Gino trying to, I'm going to call him Gino, him trying to figure it out. And Kogami kind of gets in his face and said, hey, don't try to understand the mind of criminals. You'll be taken in. Didn't you just say, aren't you worried about Akane? Aren't you the one slandering us? And Gino, we're going to put him up here. Gino, what's fascinating about him is that his father was a criminal. And they get to talking about genetics. They get to talking about, like, are you genetically predispositioned to be a criminal based on your family backstory? That is getting into some crazy stuff. We also find out the year that we're in. It's 2112. So that makes this, you know, a little bit later than Blade Runner 2049. But also it makes it kind of realistic because it's like, yeah, this is 100 years from now. Okay. I could see it. Seems legit enough. The way technology's spiking. I'm a little terrified by it, but seems legit. But yeah, so Gino's actions all make total sense now. The fact that his father was a criminal and he has constant internal pressure that he worries that he could be a criminal is so fascinating. We've seen this in other series, like we've seen Attack on Titan, you see it in Monster. There's a lot of Monster tie-ins. I'm watching Monster right now and I was like, oh man, there's some Monster tie-ins, but there is a character in that series that worries that they're going to be unreliable and untrustworthy like their father was. And then you have Gino here, who now it makes total sense why he tries so hard to separate himself from the enforcers, not only because he's afraid of becoming one of them, but because he thinks it's an inevitability. And now that we know that his partner, Ko, has become an enforcer and has fallen down the cloudy hue path, he definitely probably feels like it's a possibility, like it's gonna happen. And so that explains why he's so dead set on separating the two of them and making sure he tries to stay on the straight and narrow because he's afraid of becoming part of them as well. I think at this point, after this episode, I'm like, no, I think Gino's going to go down the path. I think so. The question is Akane, and we'll talk about her when we get to it. But yeah, they have that back and forth exchange, and they're like, this person is clearly someone that's a little bit more advanced than just hacking avatars. It's more than just that. And so that's kind of the thing of it is you have these killers and then you have them hooked up with a third party who knows the tricks of the trade and can be used to do specific crimes for them that gives them all the tools necessary to do so. But it's all under Shogo's watch. That's the thing. Shogo is like the puppet master that has this organization developed. It's like, again, talking about like Moriarty the Patriot and stuff, talking about stuff like that. It's like an organization of crime, and they're the ones giving people the means to kill others, right? Whereas in Moriarty, it's done for like pseudo Robin Hood-esque noble causes. Here, it's not. So it's a little bit more depraved than that, right? So, but oh my gosh, I really love this. So the idea, I like Matsuoka just doesn't understand the avatar stuff. He's like, why do you guys do this like virtual form? He's like, we're here. Like, it's our bodies that eat and breathe and sweat and eat. Why are we going with this weird virtual cosplay? He's in the very physical world particular, right? And I love that Akane says, you're an endangered species. He is. He's like Gen X, right? She's like, you're an endangered species. Like, people like you don't exactly exist anymore. It's like, So again, the Sybil system has probably not been around that long because he's looking at things in a much different perspective than her and even Kogami do. So it's clear that he's from he's like, you know, in our world, he is a Gen Xer. He's like the pre-internet boom, pre-technology boom. He's just like in that sweet spot of like the 70s and 80s. And he's like, I don't understand you kids. Y'all are weird. And then he's like, well, I don't understand. So she breaks it down very astutely, like a teacher would. She's like, well, the fact that people are using avatars right now, it's there, we use it. It's no different than us being given a pencil to write stuff down or be giving a kitchen knife to cut things up. She's like, technology develops and so does our want to use it. She's like, and how is that a bad thing? So she labels it, I'm going to put here, the idea of tools being given to use, and it's human nature to use them. Look, that was a very nice way to teach that one message, but you know what that connects to? Connects to two different things. One, it connects to this entire damn serial killer triangle because she just described what Shogo is having them do. She was like, oh, well, people were just given tools and they thought that would help them, so they used them. They didn't have to think about it. It's just as natural as breathing. It has nothing to do with good or bad. But then you see these killers and they were given tools by Shogo and showing these others, and they're like, well, I had this objective and I was given this tool and I used it. But it's clearly not a not good or bad scenario there. And it also relates to the idea of Kogami being like, look, I've been given these clues. I've been writing them down for 3 years. I'm trying to solve a puzzle. They've been given to me. Why is this good or bad? So yeah, it's just what she just described connects to this entire episode. And I'm like, oh my God. And so then he's like, well, you're like a teacher. And she's like, oh, really? And he said, do you know Rousseau? I didn't look up Rousseau, so I'm sorry. I didn't look up this philosopher and the discourse on inequality. I thought I was doing good enough with Plato. And so he's like, no. He's like, it's recorded in my brain, the discourse on inequality. And he's like, let me give you a tutorial about it. He says, say, for example, there are 2 hunters in the forest. Should they hunt for rabbits separately, or should they work together and go after the big prey? So that's the scenario. Do we hunt rabbits together? We have 2 hunters. Do we go after rabbits separately, or do we work together and get the bigger rabbit? That's the idea. Like, which is the better answer? What is the better scenario? Which decision? And she says, oh, well, it's of course the latter. That's the basics of game theory. You work together to catch the bigger prey. And that's when he talks about humans being social, that we're social by nature. And that tech has developed to increase that, or to complement and supplement our need to be more social. But then he asks, what about the net? Does the net make things more social? Does it have the same effect? And she says, I think so. That's so crazy, right? Because yeah, phones, telephones, speakers, things like that are designed to make communication easier. But what about the internet? Does that make communication easier, or does it make it more complicated? And the answer is a little bit more complex, right? It's not so simple. So I always thought that, yes, ideally, theoretically, working together to get the bigger prey is the ideal situation. You can maybe make that more complicated in saying, well, it depends on the circumstance and what they're using the prey for, but again, that's getting really complex. Meanwhile, Kogami's like, I already took Philosophy and Theory 101, and he figures out the discrepancies with the voice and her saying, not police, not as often. And then they have the bomb go off when they go to the apartment to go find them. Now, I think it's pretty important to note that we are in the future. The location where the avatar is, like, we don't get a lot of, so far the only outside world imagery we've really gotten has been on the rooftop where Akane meets her wealthy girlfriends for lunch. That's been like the only, other than the conservatory that we get at the end here and stuff. Most of the time it's hard to tell reality because of all the holograms. The holograms and everything make things look all bright and shiny. But here is like one of our first glimpses at the outside world without the sheen of the hologram. And there's like a van that's windows and stuff are busted out. There's like trash can fires. It's grimy. It's grisly. It looks like kind of overgrown. Like things don't look as pretty without the hologram masking it, which is very intriguing to me. But it's neat to get that like one little moment of reality. So then we have Mito. We come back to him, and he's taking painkillers. He's basically taking painkillers so that if he gets shot or something, he can keep going without the pain, which is very smart on his part, but I'm assuming they gave him those, right? And so then we cut to the phone ringing, right? Where is that phone? I want to see like where, yeah. So Cho Gu Sung is his name. So we're going to put him up here. We have Cho Gu Sung, which sounds Chinese. Gu Sung. Maybe that's why his eyes are drawn differently, but I don't think that explains the red and yellow glow of them, but I think maybe that's why it's different. But Cho. So Cho is our hacker, and he asks Mito if he's going to be able to continue on with the job. Is he going to be able... And he does a lot of manipulation, too, in this phone call. He's like, well, you're Mr. Makishima's favorite, which is a bold-faced lie. He's just the guy that he's using right now, and Cho's just doing it to manipulate him. But his eyes are so creepy, and he's like, don't screw this up. I like that poor Gino gets his hand injured, and he's like, why aren't you two injured? Like Kagari and Kunazuka, and they're like, maybe somebody hasn't been behaving well. I just got Scary Movie 2 vibes from Gino, where he's like, take my strong hand. We're going to talk about Plato's theory of forms the same time as Scary Movie 2. That's how Romania Black rolls. But yeah, he basically comes to find out that they've discovered that Spooky Boogie is the other victim. So, little tech things. We're getting like little tech discoveries as we go through this. These little creepy robots that are cleaning up the drains and stuff and picking up evidence. They are creepy, but highly effective. And then we get Akane realizing that this was her room. So we find out that this girl Shogo was in fact someone she went to school with. That's how they knew each other. And so Akane's like, I didn't really know her that well, but she feels responsible for her dying. And I really, really like that Kogami and Matsuoka, they both kind of become like little guardians of her in this moment, which is really good. The scene's really well done. Like the show knows how to use silence effectively to create a range of emotions. Because Kogami is not really... We've seen him in the flashback look pretty damn emotional, but here he keeps a very strong poker face. But you could tell just by the use of silence, the way he stares at her, that he instantly connects with how she feels, right? He connects with how she feels, and he gives the information, and then that's when he goes in there, and she says that it's her fault. She got dragged into this because of me. And Matsuoka's like, well, now, Missy. And she says it was her fault, and Kogami's like, well, he's like, did you use such and such as a decoy? I want to make note of the 3 things he asks her, because I feel like that's going to come back to the backstory, right? He says, did you use them as a decoy? And she says, no. And so then she's like, no, I didn't do that. And so then he asks her after that, he said, did you force her to cooperate? Did you force cooperation? And she says, no. And then he says, did you leak information on her to the enemy? Did you leak info? And she says, no. And so he says, then what exactly is your fault? And she says, well, she got killed. That's what happened. And he's like, yeah, if we caught the culprit last night, then she didn't have to die. But the responsibility lies with all of us. Now, he doesn't say she wouldn't have died. He said she didn't have to die if they caught the culprit. But that doesn't say she wouldn't have. But I love the use of mirrors, that it's her looking in the mirror and him looking in the mirror too. And he's kind of not directly looking in the mirror. He's kind of the side of it, but just that reflection back where he's like, look, the responsibility is with everybody. It's not just you. Let's just think about fulfilling the responsibilities and catching this person. So again, there's this idea of fulfilling responsibility and catching the culprit. And that's really where the rub is with Kogami. Kogami is not catching the culprit. So he feels like he can't fulfill that responsibility to his fellow comrade, to the enforcer that died, until he's done that. Now, in this case, we do catch the culprit, and justice is served. So by all accounts, at first when this scene was happening, I was like, oh, this is the crack. This is the moment where we see Akane kind of becoming like Kogami, where she's going through the same thing that he went through. But we do catch the culprit. So justice is kind of served, and you could argue that she has closure, right? Kogami does not have closure. She does. So unless there's a case that comes up that she doesn't get closure with, for right now, she's not on the same path as Kogami. But it becomes very clear that they are very similar beings, right? So then we have the idea of melancholia with Rainy Blue and this kid that's using the same name and info, and that they were like 16 when they disappeared. And so it can't be the grandfather because they don't have access. And so they talk about how Rainy Blue, I like the idea that Rainy Blue is just a different community. It's like, here's one Discord server, here's another Discord server, here's another server, and they all just kind of like Talisman Saloon. They all have different places. And they're like, how could you operate different avatars at the same time? Which is possible. I mean, people in the real world do it. It's just difficult if you're trying to do more than one. But the way they find out that it's Mito is just genius. And I applaud the writing of this show, because it's like, well, how do we narrow it down? Well, hell, we're in the future. We can do all sorts of crazy stuff with technology. And the world building lends itself to the technology and making it practical and real and feel justified, because you're like, well, how do we narrow down? They're like, well, let's find out. This person's trying to imitate these avatars. Let's see who's been in their server the most, who would have all the information they would need to imitate them, and then suddenly dipped out the moment that the avatar was replaced with the fake. Genius. And then they were like, we can locate these people because it's kind of like, we talked last episode about how Big Brother is really creepy, and the idea of all the surveillance is creepy, because it is, but it does come in damn handy in this case, because the moment he's discovered, they not only locate where he lives, but they determine it's suspicious that he's not been detected by the psychopath scanners for 4 years. He's been steadily avoiding anything that would make him look suspicious. And they're like, well, that's all we need. That's proof enough that we need to go scan him. It's been too long. We got a warrant. Let's go. It's just the way that they bring it together and solve it is so well done. And I was like living for this moment and that's when Kogami brings up the idea that it's the death of the author. It's like, well, the people, and this kind of brings up something really crazy too. They're like, the people that are here to watch this avatar and are here to interact with this individual, they don't really care about the individual themselves. They just care about the avatar. They care about the concept of it, not who's playing it. And I guess the best representation that's not sinister that I can think of is Doctor Who. Because in Doctor Who, there's a doctor and they're a form. They're literally a form, like an avatar. They represent this feeling. They represent this ideal. That's literally what they are. They're a form. And each version of the Doctor is like a phenomena. It's a different shade, right? It's a different shade of the Doctor. You have the first Doctor, the second Doctor, the 10th Doctor. And then the actual actors are the particulars who play that shade of this form. Look at that. Doctor Who, theory of forms. But that's kind of what Kogami is getting at. He's like, the people don't care about the individual behind the avatar. They just care about the avatar and what it represents to them and how they've distorted this, which is tied to the whole death of the author. So yeah, I was living for this episode and what it was giving us. I was like, yes, please. And they're like, this fan thinks they can do a better job at imitating the characters. The culprit is someone with a level of activity that matches their enthusiasm. And that's when we narrow it down. That's the culprit. I like that Kagari the whole time is just playing on his watch. He's just looking at stuff like, what, really? And Kogami's so just like cracks the code, just so succinct about it, right? Instantly knows what's going on. And that's when they find Mito. And that's when they narrow it down. And Shion's like, well, let's go to it. And so then they bring up the idea of the alcohol. They're like, well, why'd you bring the alcohol with you? And he's like, well, hollow scans, they get weakened by the use of alcohol. And strong alcohol is the best for handling illegal holograms. So, and then Kogami says, well, that's a tip you learn after you become 20. So I guess she's 19. I'm going to guess she's 19 and he's, 28? That's 9 years of difference. That's still doable. I feel like that's just skirting the line, but it's still doable. I can still ship it. It's fine. But yeah, so, and I love that she gets kind of like, oh, how dare you? Like, come on. She doesn't even get upset. She's just like, come on, man. And then they go into the apartment. I'm really surprised he was still there, but he distorts. He has like the pills and stuff and the pain suppressors on there. And then he like uses whatever hologram he has to distort the reality and make it to where it's trippy and they don't know who is who. I'm glad that Kogami is rational enough to not just fire off his gun at them. Instead, he like takes his time and works his way through everything. I'm glad he did that because I was like, ugh. And then, yeah. And then I just love that Matsuoka does the fire like flamethrower and he's like, poosh, and then poor Connie's like, oh my God, don't light me on fire. And then he manages, God, this show though, grisly. He shoots his arm off and then he uses the tourniquet and they say a pain inhibiting drug is what he uses. God, and they decide to leave the rest to Genoza and the others because they're like, well, we've done all we can. He's got that wound. It's not, even though he can't feel the pain, he's still going to bleed out. So we're just going to let it go and follow the blood trail and see where it leads. The animation style of him in the elevator, like just slowly losing it. Oh, it was very, very effective. Very grisly, very effective. And then they find him and he just has this moment where he gets back to his room, right? He gets back to his room. I want to see what the apartment looked like. Yeah, he runs back in the room and it's all empty. And then it just like the hologram is just like the cherubs and everything hanging there. And there's the 3 avatars that he adores, like greeting him. And he says, you guys are eternal. Like forms, right? Like you were released from the chains of a physical body and polished by a collective intelligence. Yeah, you're the souls closest to Plato's ideas. Yeah, that's what it is. It just took us that to get to it. But yes, the idea that they are the polished, necessary forms that he like practically worships, right? But the thing of it is, Shogo's more of an Aristotle guy. Shogo's more of an Aristotle man, to be honest. He's, going to fight Plato on this. And he doesn't want to he didn't want anybody else to try to, he basically took something that was constructed and made it into a form, which is distorting how that actually works, right? He kind of misunderstands Plato's idea a little bit and gets like, yeah, he misunderstands the idea and it just, oh, it's so creepy. But then you have the hacker Cho, and next to him you have Shogo. And because he's like watching, and that's when Shogo takes over. There's something I've been searching for, and for that purpose I did whatever it took. And they're like, did you read Shuji Terayama? And I want to look that up real quick. I was like, what is Shuji Terayama? A Japanese poet and dramatist. Because what does he talk about? He says, did you read Shuji Terayama? And he says, oh, you should read his play, Saraba Egayo. I want to look that up here. Saraba. Okay. So the play, has anyone seen? Oh, I don't want to do anything that's crazy. Let me see here. Shuji Terayama. And so something on Reddit was trying to like say something about psychopaths. And I was like, nope, don't want to look up that. But he's wrote, basically, Shuji Terayama was a Japanese avant-garde poet, dramatist, writer, film director, and photographer. His works range from radio drama, experimental television, underground theater, countercultural essays, Japanese new wave, and expanded cinema. Wow, he has been touted as one of the most productive and provocative creative artists to come out of Japan. Shogo is just the most literary, like, look at him. Look at him in his book club. He's just, we had 1984 last week. This week we have Terayama's drama that we can talk about. He's still, oh no, he died in 1983. He was 47. He was born in 1935. So during his career, he formed a theater troupe and he wrote different works. I want to see, like, where was the one that he wrote? He did plays. Was it says, I want to find the one that he did. They was talking about. What is it here? There, he says, because he says Saraba Ega Yo. I'm going to try to look that up. Saraba Ega Yo. Okay. It says it deals with the illusion of agency. Okay. That it deals with the illusion of agency. People rely on others to do their work for them, and the way in which these transactions happen is through the mirage of an avatar. Oh, okay. That's all I'm going to read about that. But basically, the idea is that they don't want to do things for themselves. So instead they try to get a third party to help them, and they use that as for the avatar. Well, that kind of relates to this. Also relates to the idea of Mito using Cho to do his dirty work, but also Shogo enlisting Cho to do the work for him in this regard. So we're going to talk about that more when we get to the flashback with Kogami. But yeah. And so he just doesn't understand. Mito's like, he doesn't get it. And he's like, are you Makishima? And he's like, you have a thorough knowledge of various avatars and imitated them perfectly. You can become anyone, so I was interested in what your personality was like. He's like, but you're boring, so I'm not interested anymore. He's like, nah, don't like it. He's like, figure out the end of your own story. Your core personality is null and empty. He's like, I wanted to see how you were on the inside, but I got bored with it, so now I'm done. I feel like that's why he likes Kogami so much, Shogo does, because Kogami is not null and empty inside. He's filled with passion and righteousness and all of these things, and both Shogo and Akane are trying to understand him, it seems, and it's like, but God, him like freaking out and like saying you lacked a face and you were simply able to wear a mask because you didn't have any face of your own. It just got so grisly and creepy the way the animation was right before they blew him up. Oh my God. But yeah, it's this idea that if you wear a mask, you're not showing your true face. And if you never show your true face, then you cease to have one, is what Shogo is getting at. So, and then he dies, and they're like, well, who was he talking to? And I'm like, that's the one thing that's so frustrating, is that they had to kill him, basically. I mean, that's what they had deemed necessary, but because they killed him, then they lost track any contact with Cho or Shogo, and it's like, But yeah, this series does not spare any expense on the grisly details. None whatsoever. So then Gino tells her that, you know, these are enforcers. You need to separate yourself from them. And Akane's like, but Kogami comforted me and encouraged me even though he's a criminal. It's hard to think he has the same mind as a homicidal maniac like Mito. And that's the thing, is that Gino just says, you're an inspector. You just have to do your duties as an inspector. Don't think about it. Because Gino knows that, I think Gino knows that Kogami does not have the homicidal mind that the killers do. And I don't even think that Shogo does. I think that you have two situations. You have a character, Shogo is just wanting to experiment with people. Do I think that Shogo has the killer mind, the homicidal maniac mind, like some of these killers have had? Yes, but no. I feel like Shogo does have the same mindset as them, but I think he thinks that he's better than them. I think that Shogo believes that he's way up here when he's really still in the same realm as the killers, but he just thinks he's better than them. Shogo wants to be the form, I feel. And Shogo thinks that he's the form. He's just trying to, like, manipulate the shadows or the phenomena under him to see if they can match up. And he's not found anybody that can match up. But then he's going to meet Kogami, and Kogami's the one he thinks can match up and be in the same realm as him. Maybe. Possibly. But I feel that Kogami, it's not that he has the mind of a killer, but it's that and here's the thing. Kogami is just trying to solve the case. And in Kogami's world, the only way that you can catch a monster is to become one, essentially. And that's what he's been trying to do in solving these cases, to try to get up. Is he really trying to kill people? No. Could he possibly kill people? Well, yeah. But here's the thing. Anybody can. Anybody in this world has the capability of killing someone. It's just, would you go that far? And would you ever get in the mindset where that would even be a possibility? And that's a person-by-person basis, right? That's a subjective thing. So I feel like Gino's trying to say, well, just don't think about it. If we just do our jobs, do our duties, and we just follow by these simple rules, nothing bad will happen. But as Plato's theory of the form suggests, we are all infallible, and none of us are perfect. We all can try to follow an ideal, but anybody is capable, if they're given the right tools and pushed in the right direction, to make a bad decision like this. And Gino just doesn't want Kogami to end up, or Akane to end up like Kogami did. And so that's when he's like, look, just fulfill your duties as an inspector. Draw the line between you and the enforcers. And she's like, is this an ironclad rule for this job? And he's like, no, that's just my rule. Because he doesn't want to be like his father, doesn't want to be like his friend. You know, Gino's like got a lot of pressure to not have this happen. And he's like, I lost a partner who made a mistake. And the partner he's talking about is Kogami. That's the partner that made the mistake, is Kogami. He's like, I lost my partner. He became an enforcer. I couldn't stop him. And so he gives her, he's like, I don't want you to make the same mistake. I don't want you to end up like Kogami and be somebody that I can't protect anymore and that now I have to oversee. So he sends her a message. She's like, I could tell you the flashback, or I could just send it to you and you can interact with it, right? And she's like, this is a file from the personnel department. And he's like, make sure to destroy it after you look through it. I don't want it tracing back to Kogami and finding out that I shared this with you. So we have the information about Kogami. Shinya Kogami. My dogs. Enforcer, male. 28 years old, former inspector. And she's like, really? While investigating an unsolved case, special case 102. That's when we get, I love his crime coefficient rapidly increased. He prioritized the investigation over therapy treatments. So we find out some stuff about Kogami. Instead of going to therapy, he did the investigations instead. So he refused therapy. And so the crime coefficient didn't go away. And so because it didn't go away, it deviated from the regulation value and he was demoted to enforcer. And that's what happened. And so I love that we transitioned to the second part of the episode. It was like we transitioned to part 2 and we see our boy, we see Kogami, who's at least 3 years younger, so he's 25. And we see him on the scene in his suit jacket and everything. And it's all, I like how you can tell the difference between the enforcers and the investigators, because whenever Kogami is in his investigator uniform, he's got a vest, his tie's all done up nice, he has a very pressed collar, and then you see the one enforcer guy and his tie's undone, his shirt's unbuttoned, and then once Kogami becomes an enforcer, tie comes off, shirt's unbuttoned, you know, it's just like that disheveled look. And you have the one guy smoking. Kogami does not seem to be smoking there. So you have the enforcer that's smoking, Kogami is not. So it seems like Kogami has followed the path and he's followed the path like, we'll get his name, it's like Shayama. He became basically like his friend after he lost him. So this part's interesting. Sasayama. There we go. I was like, what is his name? Sasayama is his name. Sasayama. Yes. So this part, the way that they do it in the episode is fascinating to me. They give you the whole exposition of the backstory from the seat of the cab car of the police car. Like, you don't see hardly anything. You see Shogo walk by, but you see hardly anything. I want to go back and watch it. You just get to hear the radio transmission between the two of them, and that's it. Like, he left the car, went on his way, and then something happened. So I'm so fascinated. I want to know. But yeah, Sasayama. And so then we have, if you don't like it, shoot me. That's your job. So this is talking about Sasayama. And he says to shoot him. And crime coefficient is 282. Mitsuru Sasayama. Right. And so as an enforcer registered at the Criminal Investigation Department, he is an in-force at-will target. And he's like, don't go, Sasayama. So he went out to go track somebody down and kept running, right? And so then we hear, you can see on the screen, Sasayama and Kogami talking to one another, and Kogami yells after him. And that's what he says, so it was you, Kogami. I came alone. I left the handling of the crime scene to Gino and the others. Okay, so we have this idea that Sasayama took off. Let me get this right. Sasayama took off and Kogami followed. Right? And Gino and Co were left at the crime scene. All right. So we got that. He's like, I left the crime scene handling to Gino and the others. And he's like, where are you, Sasayama? And he says, a GPS. And then we see Shogo walking in the rain, just walking by the car, right? Just leaving. He says, the GPS is working, but the map is pitch black. I can't see a thing. You left the crime scene. Oh. So what we don't know is that we don't know if this conversation is happening how long ago before Kogami finds Shogo and finds Sasayama in the resin. We don't know how long that's passed. We get this conversation going. We get the idea that Sasayama went after Shogo and them, got out of the car, and then presumably died. But we don't know how much time has passed. He's like, you left the crime scene. And then what does he say there? He's like, are you sure that was okay? He's like, I don't want you telling me that. In any case, let's meet up. Yes. And he's like, I have a bad feeling. Don't do anything reckless by yourself. And he says, okay, but I myself can't tell where I'm at. So yeah, so as they were talking on the phone, he's like, oh, you're coming after me. And he's like, yeah, don't move. And he's like, well, I don't really know where I'm at, but we'll meet up. And then that's when all this went down, right? He says, I can't tell where I am. These alleys are like a labyrinth. So he got out of the car, went into the alleyway, and then Shogo killed him and propped him up like a stuffed dummy for Kogami to find. And then was walking past the cop car as this was going down. Okay. And then we hear some noise. And Kogami, and he says, Makishima. So he says Shogo's name. He says, Makishima, what's going on? And he's like, I'll explain later. I have to follow him. So he's like, hold on. What is this about? If I follow him to wherever he's going, I'll find Toma. I'm sure of it. So Sasayama knew about Toma and knew about Makishima. How did Sasayama know about Makishima? And if he's known about Makishima, then why hasn't Kogami narrowed down who Makishima is? Like, why hasn't he figured that out? And he says, I'll find Toma, I'm sure. Because we know Toma's the guy, right? That's the suspect. He says, I'm sure of it. He's probably the one behind the specimen case. He determines that Shogo was that. And then that's when he's like, Sasayama. and yells after him. And he's like, the signal's out of range. Okay, and then that's when the bots come down looking for him, right? And that's when we see the sirens and everything. And we see him going down the street. And we see Kogami looking. We see the fans. He's like, Shepherd 2, you're going too fast. Where are you right now? In the first episode, Shogo talked about how they needed, or in the last episode, he talked about how, are they going to be guinea pigs or are they going to be wolves? Like, we don't have any shepherds. Oh my God. Okay. Or they've mentioned shepherds in the past. Where are you right now? And then we see him with the gun. He's like, I can't find hound number 4, Sasayama. So Gino was shepherd 1, and hound, the other hounds, Sasayama was one of the hounds. He's like, what's going on? Where did he go? And they're like, calm down, Kogami. Things are getting out of control. Come back. And he didn't come back. He pursued, and they're like, I'll bring Sasayama back. And that's when he found him. Oh my God. And all you see is like, you can see like body parts, and you see the hands, and there's like fingers and hands sticking out of his face. Oh my God. And it just shows him seeing it. Yeah, and it's just like, the eyes and everything have been hollowed out. Oh my God, Sasayama. And it's like the artwork, very similar to the artwork of the girl that's left behind, right? The moment that Kogami sees, the moment he sees the artwork, the body there, he's going to connect it back to this. I'm dead set. But yeah, and then you see Sasayama, and his like face is all like scarred, and his eyes are hollowed out. Oh. And then Kogami wakes up. Yeah. With his damn conspiracy board. And he's got the cigarettes just like Sasayama had. And he's looking at the conspiracy board. Yep. The picture of him. And he just lets it burn up. Mm-hmm. So yeah, meanwhile, we go to this very Neon Genesis style room where not Gendo, old lady Gendo is sitting there. So she's the one in charge of seemingly the task force, the inspectors, and Gino gives his report to her saying, oh, look, she's working hard, old Akane. She's inexperienced and she acts unprofessionally rather often. This woman, she looks interesting. But it's true, she's an excellent employee. And he's like, I think she's got a bright future. And she's like, well, let's hope so. Let's hope she doesn't end up, there's still at least a chance she'll end up in an unfortunate state as your partner who started the same year as you, how that goes. And he's like, yes, chief. She's like, you inspectors have very demanding jobs. She basically states that what's interesting is, like, there's the earth behind them. Is that just like a projection? Is that a mirror? Is that a window? Are we even on Earth? Are we on a different planet than Earth? Or is that Earth on the screen behind her? Or is it just an image of their world? We're not even going to go there this episode. I've already breached an hour into this. We're not going to go into that this episode. I do like the state of her room, although it is giving off very heavy Neon Genesis vibes. She's doing the Gendo pose. Does not give me good vibes, but we'll talk about that in a little bit with Lavinia. And so she's like, you guys have very demanding jobs. She even has glasses like Gendo, let's be real. Even when you face the distorted minds of criminals and enforcers, you have to keep a sense of your duty and an unyielding spirit. You can't let this control you. So she says, you should be on your guard, Genoza. And she says, a causal relationship between genes and crime coefficients hasn't been determined yet or scientifically proven, but it's not been unscientifically proven either. So she talks about his dad, and now it explains everything with Gino. So I'm so fascinated to know more about him and Matsuoka. I think that could be interesting. But he's like, yeah, I hope you won't make the same mistake as your father. I hope it from the bottom of my heart. I'm like, is Matsuoka his father? No, I don't think that's the case. But he's like, I'll keep that in mind. So then we go to this conservatory which we talk about the conservatory. That's where this, I was a little confused at first because we've done so many flashbacks in this episode that I was wondering if, like, for a second I thought it was maybe a flashback to Akane's past, like the school that she went to. I thought maybe the one teacher looks a little bit like Genoza, so I'm like, is it a relative? Or we're going to get into his backstory this episode? Now's not the time. But instead it's a conservatory. In faith, they are as true of heart as we. We men may say more, swear more, but indeed our shows are more than will, for still we prove much in our vows, but little in our love. Okay, so let's talk about Lavinia as we get into this part here. Because this whole conservatory scene starts with these girls reading a Shakespearean line about the power of men and how we value more in our promises than we do in our... We value more, it talks about valuing more with our word than our heart. And again, this series, I tell you, the idea, this very first line talks about word versus the heart, what we say versus what we think and what we feel, right? And we just saw that with Genoza feeling conflicted because he doesn't want to become like his father, but saying like, yes, I will hold up to these ideals. Yes, I will be like this. Does he actually think that or believe that? Maybe not. But let's talk about Lavinia before we get into this. So Lavinia is a character in a Shakespearean play. This is, Romania Black is in teacher mode throughout this entire episode, let me tell you. But Titus Andronicus. Lavinia is very similar to Ophelia from Hamlet. She's the female love interest in the play that gets screwed over royally, as Ophelia does. I think it's very intriguing that we choose Lavinia versus Ophelia, because Ophelia would seem like the very logical choice, the very commoner choice, but Shogo ain't reading your basic. He ain't no basic bitch when it comes to book club. He's reading the hard shit, let me tell you. So in this, basically Lavinia's character is categorized as the good girl. She's portrayed to be the good girl. She's valued for her beauty and basically is viewed as an object throughout the entire play. She doesn't really get much agency of her own. She is physically sexually assaulted, and she also is metaphorically. They use the term rape in the play. Obviously, she is metaphorically, as she is shown to be powerless in the position that she is in. And the notes about the play talk about how the word rape is divine and derived from the Latin word rapine, which means to seize or rob, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's important we talk about that definition. And the main thing with Lavinia's character is that she is often silent throughout the play. There's all these things happening around her and she doesn't really do anything. There's a character in Attack on Titan that is a very good representation of Lavinia. If you've watched Attack on Titan, you know exactly who that is. She's silent and doesn't do anything, and she's the subject, and she's often subjected to male authority and power, which is funny because we start out this entire scene with a reading of a Shakespearean line that is connected to male authority and power. And Lavinia, though she's viewed as the good girl and she does everything for the male characters and is silent on the subject and is metaphorically and physically assaulted and used, she is not perfect, because in the play there are several people who have noted that she does make some snide comments at certain points, showing that she is not entirely perfect and may have kind of a more sinister side to her character. So again, if you can think of which Attack on Titan character that is, comment down below. But the important thing is I got these little word boxes because lots of things are talked about in this part of the episode, the title of Lavinia, and not just the one girl that has issues with her dad, which we'll talk about, but the girls' conservatory, the idea of being the perfect good girl and the perfect girl. We'll talk about that in this. But basically, we've got all these girls here hanging out in this conservatory, and they're reading. I like the incorporation of what makes this series so fun is it's realistic in how they integrate the technology, because, you know, in the more wealthier areas of town, technology is like it consumes everything. Here, it's kind of more subdued, and you kind of see like they still have old school desks, they still have a chalkboard, but then like what they're reading, they have a tablet beside the book they're reading that they can scroll through and do like instant messenger and their homework on and take notes on while they're reading. So it's this weird and very realistic incorporation of physical and digital technology. It's very multimodal. I like it a lot, but it's, yeah, 12th night. And so they're reading Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. And so instead they're all, like half of them are reading, but they're also on their instant messenger, like around this. And the one girl is texting. I was like, oh, we got some lady action going on in this. We do have some lady action. And so like Titus Andronicus and Macbeth, right? I like his tragedies. They're interesting and they're especially cruel. I'm like, well, the fact that you like the plays because they're cruel, I can't imagine. And I like that her emblem, her representation on the avatar is a crab, right? Getting these girls in her pincers, right? And so we see her being like, oh, she's very excited. So then we cut back to the lounge that the enforcers have. I'm jealous. They have a billiards table. They have pinball machines. They've got a crane game. They've got a jukebox. They've got a whole damn setup. I want this setup. I want this Route 58 experience that's down here. It's freaking badass. And so Kagari's like, well, why aren't you looking all this up in the database? And Akane basically says, well, I don't want Kogami knowing that I've accessed these files. I just want to know what he's about. And he's like, are you concerned about Ko? And he's like, are you in love? And she laughs about it. She's like, oh, yeah, sure, I'm in love. I like that she laughs about it. Like, really? Come on. She doesn't blushy about it. But I like that. I like the development with that because it means, normally when you have a female character that is wanting to get closer to a male character, it's kind of stereotypical to be like, oh, I don't love him, not me, not really, and be all kind of cindery about it. No, Akane is very straightforward. She's like, in love with him. And whether she is or not, she doesn't really deny it, but she doesn't really admit it either. She just kind of laughs it off. Akane is a different breed of character, let me tell you. So she asks if Kagari has ever been in love, and he makes this damn ass spread. I want those tacos, street tacos with the pasta salad and the egg. Cook for me anytime, sir. And he says, well, of course I have. Not only have I been in love, but I've done all sorts of bad things. But it's kind of one of those things where it's kind of like one of those things where if you have to say that you've done it, have you really? He's like, I'm a bad boy. And it's like, are you, Kagari? I do like the sign that says Big York flannel shirts on the wall. Like, what? Amazing. He's like, I've glimpsed into a world that a wholesome girl like you can't even imagine. Okay, so this entire episode, we talk about Lavinia, right? Not only is it talking about the girls' conservatory, but the concept of Lavinia and being the good girl also describes Akane, because again, they view her, the enforcers view Akane as this good girl. She's the prodigy from school. She's wholesome. She only does good things. She has a very clean slate, right? They view her as this good girl archetype. And even the woman in charge, the chief, when her and Genoza are talking about her potential and her bright future, it's viewing her as this good girl archetype. Like, oh, well, she's the prime candidate to be an inspector. She's the golden girl. She's everything that could possibly be good about a candidate, and she can do no wrong. That's kind of the same. They kind of make her like Lavinia in this, like putting her up on this pedestal and making her out to be something that she may not necessarily be. So we're going to talk about that here in a second, right? So yes, they make her out as being this wholesome girl, the enforcers do. And so he talks about, and she's like, really? And he's like, yeah. He's like, for example, this one. She's like, is it juice? And he's like, no, it's not juice. It's alcohol. Real alcohol. Old Masayoka shared it with me to use. He's like, these days, and I thought this was very interesting world building. These days, people are too afraid of getting addicted to alcohol and it affecting their crime coefficient, so they stick to safe therapeutic tripping or they go virtual. That's such a crazy world building thing. It's so simple, but it's so interesting because I was wondering, I'm like, what about drugs and alcohol? Because they talk about like inhibitors and things like that, and those seem to be illegal. So the idea that nobody drinks anymore because they're afraid it's going to accidentally raise their crime coefficient is fascinating to me. That instead they go and do these safe shrooms somewhere or do like virtual trips. And it's amazing to think about. And she's like, oh. And so he's like, she's like, well, is that for drinking or blowing fire? And he's like, oh my God, seriously? She's like, never mind. You didn't get the joke. And he's like, well, this is a kind of naughty fun that's our privilege. So are you going to drink or not? And she's like, wow, this is really good. And he's like, yeah, this is real cooking. So if I get drunk, I could start to tell you all sorts of things. And so here's the thing. She drinks with him. They have several glasses together. She drinks the whole thing down. He gets super wasted. She does not. And he talks about, basically reveals that he knows nothing, right? He just heard that he was an enforcer, and the enforcer under him got killed, and that's why he became an enforcer. And she's like, oh, killed? He's like, he was going after the culprit, but then he became the victim. So she's like, huh. She didn't get everything out of that message. He's like, his name was Sasayama. He was killed in the same manner as other victims, and I heard it was terrible. Which kind of goes back to this last case, because Shogo, the girl she went to school with, was killed in the same manner as the other avatars, right? And again, we talk about Lavinia. The idea of something, the definition of rape means to rob or steal. You could argue that much like Lavinia, Shoko's avatar was stolen from her. And the same way that Talisman's was stolen from them, which connects back to Lavinia. And the idea of you have Shogo, who is putting on the persona of Spooky Boogie and trying to be this emblematic character of what her fans wanted, and that wasn't really what she was on the inside, and that identity ends up getting stolen from her anyway, along with her agency, and she's forced to stay silent because she's dead. It all connects to that. So I was like, oh, that's a really interesting connection back to the last episode, as well as the idea that Kogami and Akane have experienced similar situations. They're like, but the case was never solved, and Ko is still investigating it. And he's like, anyway, he's like, how come you're okay after drinking so much? And she's like, She doesn't say anything. She's like, well, you get drunk too easily. So there's that idea, right? That maybe I would really like it if Akane just was kind of special and things didn't affect her. But here's the thing. Her not getting drunk and not getting affected, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is the fact that she's not affected by something that should alter her mood a good thing or a bad thing? Does that make her kind of like a form, right? I don't know, right? Because here's the thing. Akane's, her alcoholic intolerance, or her alcoholic tolerance in this case, it shows that there could be a secret side to Akane, that she's not affected by these things. She can think rather clinically about them, and what does that say about her, right? When life gives you lemons, make lemonade candy. In Akane's case, because that's her avatar name. So, lemons are sour. So there is a secret side to Akane that maybe even Akane isn't quite aware of. But Kogami was kind of like that too. And Kogami figured out that secret side of him whenever his partner was killed. So what if something similar happens and Akane goes through the same sensation? What's that going to be like? So she goes and sees Shion and Kunizuka. Oh my God, the specimen case. And they talk about how it was this technique for preserving tissue by impregnating it with resin. And so the idea is that she pulls up an image of it. She's like, the specimen case, the process was used to commit grotesque murders. She pulls up this picture of it, and instantly Akane is like, ooh. And they were dismembered and the body was cut open, right? And so after that, the plastination was used to they were basically turned them into a specimen. And so we have the image of Sasayama, and their body is completely dismembered, and it just shows the head sticking up, like the arms are holding it up, and their body is completely dismembered. They were brought right into the middle of town and displayed. Yeah. Then they were brought into the middle of the town and displayed, and people thought they were just underneath a holographic illumination in the entertainment district. So people thought that they were staring at art, and it was actually a person. Kind of like what ends up happening with the fountain and the girl at the very end of this. They were facing the dismembered body underneath it. So there is a question a little bit about that image of Sasayama. Shows him completely dismembered, like his body parts are all over the place. So that does beg the question of how long was he, what was the time frame between Sasayama disappearing and getting dismembered and filled with resin and Kogami finding him, because it seems like it just happens in this episode, but clearly there was a time frame there. There was a jump in time because the killer had to have had long enough to have done the deed, right? So, but then they talk about the person they suspect did it, right? So they said it was so bad the news even imposed a ban so people weren't getting freaked out. And Akane says, I'm sorry they're discussing this while eating. And Kunazuka's like, what? I don't mind this at all. This is fine. What are you talking about? This is fine. And then the fact that Shion says yayoi wouldn't get worked up over something like this. I was like, oh! She's like, no. She's into more violent and passionate stuff. I was like, I think it's pretty obvious that Yayoi and Shion are basically the two women from Neon Genesis. They're inspired by those women in Neon Genesis, and they're lesbians. So I'm all for it. I hardcore ship them together. I love this. I want them together. I want all the fan art. Give me Shion and Yayoi. I love them. And I'm like, they both kind of look at each other, and then Akane's like, what is happening here? But here's the thing. To go with that, again, we talk about Lavinia again. We're going to bring it back again. We have the person who is in charge and the chief of investigators, a woman, who we have Akane and the idea of compliance. So this idea of silence tied to subjection to male authority and power. The inspector, the chief of the inspectors kind of subverts that because she's a woman. So she's kind of at the top of the ladder, right? So that subverts that idea from Lavinia. But then you also have Akane, who over the course of this series so far, with the exception of Shion and Kunizuka, has been surrounded by male authority figures who have told her to just comply, get in line, do your job, be a good girl, and don't get caught up in this world where you could be anything but or be robbed of your title as an enforcer. So she kind of is forced into like this compliance, right? But in her own way, she kind of subjects that and subverts it a little bit. And then you have Shion and Kunizuka who kind of subvert that too by being like, oh, well, we're not going to let any men like tell us what to do. We're both into each other. No, we've subverted that problem. We've avoided that. We've skirted around the edge of that. So it's all tied thematically to it, which I find fascinating, right? And then Yanakane's just like, oh, did I walk into this conversation? And Kunizuka's like, yes. Which is kind of funny because Akane kind of has Shinji hair, so it makes it even more funny that Akane is like female Shinji in this. I love it. And she's like, you guys were talking about the specimen case, right? Can we go on? And so like, yes, they did an investigation saying that the person who had to do the resin would probably have been an expert in pharmacy or chemistry. And while working on the case, Sasayama was killed. And she stops there, like she knew Sasayama, so she knew this was him. And she kind of was like, like this. Like she takes a moment, like out of respect to him, to pause and have a moment of silence while investigating a totally unrelated case of a missing person, a high school teacher that came across plastination resin in his apartment. This guy, Toma. So here's the thing. Sasayama seems like they knew who Makishima was. Sasayama knew Makishima. And he seems like he was getting close to finding out where Toma was. So my question is, does Kogami know about Makishima? Why is Kogami not looking at Makishima? I feel like we're going to find out. Or if he has, it's at a dead end. He's like, he went missing. And after he went missing, the crime stopped. So it's certain he was the culprit. But all we had was circumstantial evidence, so it ended up as an unsolved case. But they've never found him. He didn't have any knowledge of chemistry, so even the question of who created the resin remains a mystery. So was there an accomplice? And they were like, well, yeah, but why would it be this big chain of command, right? But that's the thing. So what we can determine is that, yeah, if Sasayama was the victim, then you have, if Toma was the killer that killed Sasayama, then Makishima was the one that was, but it wasn't even Makishima that knew how to do the resin. Makishima probably found somebody to do the resin the same way that he's having Cho be the hacker for the crimes that Mito commits. So it's like you have Shoko and Sasayama, your two victims. one with Kogami and one with Akane, right? You have those two things. Then you have the killers, which could be Toma and Mito. Then you have the ones that were supplying them the tools, like Cho with the hacking and whoever made the resin. But at the top of the pyramid, orchestrating the whole thing is still Shogo. Just insanity, right? Insanity. So yeah, how it was acquired remains a mystery as well. And then so we have the friends meet up. They've switched tables, they've switched seats, and they're like, man, you're having a rough time. And she's like, yeah, I'm getting worked hard here. And so she's like, I can't really talk about it. It's confidential. And they're like, what about this guy you seem to like? They're like, was he a prodigy at school like you were? And she's like, yes, he was. So yeah, Kogami was basically like her, had the same bright future as her, but ended up getting upset and obsessed with this case, and it raised his crime coefficient to the point where he had to become an enforcer. And she is, the show is setting up that she's following in the same footsteps. The only thing is, her comrade hasn't died and pushed her over the edge. Now, whether that happens or not in this series, I don't know. But that's not happened yet. So it's going to be interesting to see, my theory is either one of two things. My theory is, and I don't want to say this because I don't want it to happen, but I'm trying to think, like, if the show is going to try to have Akane be put in a similar situation as Kogami was, well, then somebody on the Enforcer Task Force is going to have to die. Do I think it's Kunizuka? No, because she's not really that close to her. Do I think it's Shon? No, she's not that close to her, and Shon's, like, in the office all day. So the question is it going to be Genoza? I don't think it'll be Genoza, because I think Genoza is going to have to be the one that makes the decision, like, is he going to support her becoming like Kogami? Is he going to try to talk her off the ledge? Like, is he going to end up going off the ledge himself, right? So I don't think it's going to be Genoza. I think the person that's going to die in this season, if we're going to have Shogo be our villain that we catch at the end of the season, the person that's going to die is either going to be Matsuoka or Kagari. I think that she's getting closer to Kagari. She's getting closer to Matsuoka. I think one of them is going to die. And then the question is going to be, is she going to go off the deep end like Kogami and become an enforcer like him? Or is she going to be able to have something within her that keeps her from following the same path? That's the question. And is Kogami the one that Shogo thinks that he's looking for, but he's actually looking for Akane? I don't know. I'm so intrigued. I'm so excited. I want to know more. But then, yeah. So Satsuki Kuzuhara is still missing. The one girl's still missing. And so we have the two friends that are talking and sitting next to one another. And they're looking at Miss Oryu, right? So we have the two friends. She's like, I heard the teachers have been ordered to not talk about it. And so like, oh, not to worry the students. And she's like, oh my God, really? Why? That worries us even more. And so like the selling point of the school is to keep girls of susceptible age isolated from society in the conservatory. Again, we'll keep them away from society so they can be pure little good girls. And then we have Oryu. Which the moment she showed up on the scene, I was like, oh, that girl is the killer. She just had that air about her. It was just like, no, she's too perfect, right? It's always the quiet ones. And she has like a Mean Girls entourage. And she's like, I'm a little afraid of her. Her eyes are sometimes blank. Like, girl, you're not wrong. If she's giving off red flags, you are probably correct. They're staring into a different dimension. She's seeing something the rest of us cannot see. So then we see the two friends. Yeah, her and the two friends. And they're like, oh, hey. And she's like, I'm sorry to interrupt your lunch. And she's like, what brings you here? And she's like, oh, well, neither of you belong to any clubs, right? So educational organizations that have club activities, like our school, Osio Academy, are very rare these days. So I thought I'd be ashamed to miss out on that. And she's like, what are you recruiting us? I love she's instantly like against the idea. She's like, I'm the president of the art club. So I'd like to see if you'd come and see us in our club room. And then she tells the one girl, she's like, I get absorbed in thought, but it's not like I'm looking into a different dimension. I'm not an alien. Like, she just calls all of us out, and they're like, oh my God. I like this one girl, though. Like, Oryu, she looks like Mistress Nine from Sailor Moon, and then this one girl that's, like, not having any of it looks like Sailor Jupiter. So I'm like, good on her, right? Good on her. And she's like, Mika. Yeah, I'm with Mika. I'd be suspicious of her too. And Mika's just like, I don't care. I feel like Mika is just like, whatevs. Not going to be worried about her. We're fine. And she's like, sorry. But then, meanwhile, we have this one girl show up. And she's the girl that was in the classroom that was chatting with her. Right? That was chatting with her and goes to the art room to see her. Yeah. So is this the girl that went missing, I'm assuming? So she talks about her dad. So she's like, I heard about your father and your mother's new husband. So it sounds like her father became a criminal and the mom remarried because they were in debt. But she's like, Yoshika, right? What'd they say, like, which girl had gone missing? Which girl had gone missing? Because I just said, yeah, Satsuki went missing. So yeah, so this new girl, she's with the pigtails. So I'm assuming she's a victim, but not the victim that we see in the fountain later on, right? She's going to be one that I'm sure we discover next episode. Okay. But yeah, so the one girl with pigtails, Yoku or whatever her name is, she, you know, you feel bad for her because she talks about how this like new boyfriend of her mom is like basically creepily like obsessed with her and in her room and her things and is possibly like trying to mess with her, and it's not cool. And Oryu kind of just preys upon that. She just finds her so tragic. And she's like, my psychopath last week was very cloudy. And she's like, I wish you could live the life that you want and how hard it was. She's like, this system determines everyone's aptitudes and we have no choice but to live by it and be satisfied with the happiness that's forced upon us. And we're unable to make our real dreams come true. And she just like seduces her. And she's like, you desire, the person you desire to be in your true worth. Don't you want to try to discover them? And then, yeah. So like, okay, this girl, I want to make sure and see if she's the same girl that's at the very end, right? Maybe she is. Because she's doing the really creepy painting or the creepy portrait of the girl with the body parts and stuff. But then this girl is in a different portrait at the end. So maybe she's not the one. I don't think she's the one that's in the fountain at the end. And she's like, I can show you the character I like is Titan's daughter, Lavinia. Titus's daughter. And yeah, she just like seduces her. Poor Lavinia was killed by her own father. Man, Oryu, I mean, she finds like a like-minded kindred spirit in Shogo because her ideals seem very similar to Shogo's. The question though is, I feel like Oryu is lulled into this environment by Shogo's promise to like let her have freedom and do what she wants. And she's like, yes, that's exactly the philosophy that I believe in. I would love that. And she's trying to expose other girls to that as well. So the question is, what's going to happen from that? Right? Because in the image that she was drawing when the pigtail girl shows up is what we see the girl at the end. And I want to go back to the drawing she did of the pigtail girl at the very end of this. But anyway, we go back to the one guy that was taken in from last episode. And so he basically says that the technology that was sent to him to control the drones was mailed to him just in an envelope saying use however you want to. And that's the thing. It's a social experiment. He just says he was given Hey, Huckleberry! He was given the code. And that what happened is that they were just given tools to do the crime by somebody that was just giving them the means to do it. How could the sender predict that he would kill in the first place? And that's the type of person, it's like they figured that Kanahara, just by checking the records of the staff's periodic checkups, there was someone else who could do the same thing. It wasn't confidential either. It was all public. So yeah, they basically are just actively looking for people that are cracks in the system, that are cracks in the foundation, and targeting them and giving them the means to see what they'll do. Being like, well, you're like the one girl, her hue was cloudy. So now the girl Oryu is like, well, don't you want to have freedom to do whatever you want? So that's kind of like, it's like Shogo is making Oryu a young version of him. And she's going to make this one girl the killer and doing it to the victim. So it's like, she's just preying on people, and Shogo's trying to create more and more ladders of people like him. What the fudge? So yeah, and that's when Kogami is creating a crime by bringing two separate things together. Yeah. And that's what it is. That's his goal. He's bringing coefficients together to create crimes. Yep. And then we see his face, that look on his face is like a monster because that's that anger. He basically, Shogo's being Kevin Spacey trying to get Brad Pitt to commit a crime. And it's worked so far, and now he's trying to recreate it. Basically. And then, yeah, and Genoza's like, it can't be. It can't be him. He's a ghost. You're chasing after something that doesn't exist. And he's like, no, I've got all these cases. I've been searching for this guy for 3 years. I know he exists. He's like, I'm going to sell the score. And he's got his own conspiracy board, everything. All the boxes, all the case notes like that. It's consuming all of his time. And Genoza's like, oh my God. And you can tell Genoza, he feels for Kogami, I believe, because he's like, yeah, it sucks that this guy was killed. The enforcer, Sasayama, was killed. But he's like, are you going to let this consume your life? And Kogami's like, yeah, because I know that I can solve the case. Oh my God. Meanwhile, they turn off the fountain. And they're like, is it a work of art or something? That's creepy. Is it a doll? Nope. And it's the drawing she had of this body twisted together like a piece of artwork. Yep. Just like the resin and everything. Only it's, yeah, they've made it into a piece of art. Like, who the hell did it? Yep, and that's the thing. And he's like, well, it looks pretty, doesn't it? Like Lavinia. But then the guy says, but I wouldn't take it home. He's like, it's very elaborate. Though I wouldn't want to display it at my home. Yeah, it's like literally a girl that's been disfigured and rearranged this piece of art. And the guy's like, well, it is pretty. Lavinia. Right? And then we go back to Oryu, who's learning from a great... And yeah, so we see that the girl with the pigtails, but she's got all these slashes through her neck, through her arms, through her hands. So she's probably cut up somewhere. But we haven't found out where yet. And that's when Shogo is like, do you think Lavinia is happy being freed from her violated body? Because the girl should not survive her shame. And by her presence still renew her sorrows. And she knows him as Mr. Maki. Yeah, Makishima Sensei. Beautiful flowers will eventually wither and fall. That's the fate of all living beings. If that's the case, it's just natural for one to want to stop time while they're still blossoming in full glory. But if you really loved her, as if she was your own daughter, will you too say that? He's like, kill her for whom my tears have made me blind. And she's like, oh, well, that would be a problem because I still have many more drawings to complete in the future. She's like, oh no, I'm planning on being a serial killer. Thank you. So yeah, so Shogo and her, oh my God, as a duo. Yeah. And he's just using her the same way he's just experimenting with her as anybody else. What? But he's like, are you going to be satisfied with just killing her? And she's like, well, there's only one way to find out. Oh my God. So yeah. Yep. I've talked for over an hour and a half. But yeah, so basically all the stuff with the idea, the theory of forms, Lavinia tying these two episodes. It's fun stuff. Hope you enjoyed that. Really fun time. I enjoyed it. I love this show. I'm all in. It's grisly. It's kooky. It's amazing. I'm like, mwah, singing its praises. I have fallen in love with it. And so I hope you all are excited about this. But yeah. So this girl's very, very like on the serial killer route. She's killed once and now she wants to kill again. The question is, are we going to find Pigtail Girl? What are we going to do with her? She drew her naked. So did they canoodle? But now the question is, what's going to happen? What about Mika? What about the others? Are they going to go to the conservatory next episode and try to figure stuff out? I feel like this specific case, because of the artwork being frozen, because of the body being frozen like artwork in time, like the specimens case, I feel like this is going to be the tipping point. The Kogami is going to be like, no, this is very too similar to what happened with Sasayama. So something's amiss. It's too similar. What do we do with this? And how does this relate to Cho? Like, is Oryu the one, is Oryu the one that's doing the actual murders and rearranging the parts, or is it a third party that's helping her to do it? That would seem to be the case, but we just need to find out more. So, in the meantime, I hope you all enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun, but I'm excited to see what happens next episode. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe. Take care. I'm excited to hear your comments down below. Please no spoilers. And yeah, we'll just see what happens next week with the next episode of Psychopaths. Bye.